Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are taking a really concentrated journey, to extract some of the most vital insights from a single, well, honestly, a profoundly challenging source.
It really is. I mean, it's not light reading by any stretch.
Exactly. We are looking at an excerpt from Maria Montessori's book, Education in Peace. And specifically, we're focusing on chapter 4.
Right, which is actually the transcript of her opening address at the Sixth International Montessori Congress.
Yeah, and our mission for this deep dive is to explore this, radical reframing of how society views children. We want to see how shifting our perspective on childhood isn't just about better parenting or having nicer classrooms.
Right, it's way bigger than that.
It is. Montessori positions it as the literal, practical blueprint for averting global war, like achieving actual world peace.
Yeah, it's a text that basically asks us to completely dismantle our assumptions. Everything we think we know about how the human mind is formed or how societies are built from the ground up, she just tears it down.
Right, and to jump right into why this text is so incredibly necessary, I want you, the listener, to think about how we usually try to fix the world when things go wrong.
Well, we usually look at the top.
Yeah. Exactly. It's like we act like architects looking at a towering skyscraper. When there's a problem, we instinctively look at the top floors.
The visible stuff.
Right. We look at the governments, the international treaties. We look at economic policies and military alliances.
Right. We focus on the grand, highly visible structures of adult society. Like if the roof of civilization is leaking.
Or if the building is, swaying dangerously in the wind.
Exactly. We assume we need to take the elevator all the way up to the penthouse and just repair the roof. We try to fix adult institutions using adult logic.
Yeah, we hold a summit, we sign a treaty, we pass a new law. But what if someone came along and told you that the roof isn't the problem at all?
That's the kicker.
Right. What if they pointed all the way down to the dirt, to the very bedrock beneath the foundation of the building, and said, you've been completely ignoring the soil this thing is built on, and that is why your entire society is collapsing.
Which is such a wild concept.
Yeah.
It completely shifts the paradigm of where we need to focus our energy, our resources, and, our intellect.
Yeah.
It takes the focus away from the visible symptoms, the wars, the economic crashes, the political unrest, and it forces us to look at the invisible origins of human behavior.
And setting the scene for this specific address is crucial because this isn't some abstract philosophical musing delivered in a vacuum.
No, the context is everything here.
It really is. Because when most people hear the phrase Montessori Congress, it is incredibly easy to picture a standard, somewhat dry pedagogical meeting.
Yeah, you might imagine a group of earnest teachers sitting around in a circle discussing classroom management.
Or the most efficient way to teach the alphabet.
Or maybe debating how to arrange tiny wooden furniture in a preschool.
Right, exactly. But the modern perception of Montessori is often reduced to, wooden toys and child-sized brooms.
It really is.
But from the very first breath of this address, she explicitly rejects that narrow domestic view of her work. She states, unequivocally, that the core essence of these congresses is not pedagogy in the traditional sense.
No, she says they are gathered for the defense of the child.
The defense of the child. I mean, that specific phrasing alone completely changes the temperature of the room.
It does. It implies that the child is currently under attack.
Precisely. It implies a state of siege, and that feeling of siege is amplified 100-fold by the broader historical context of the text.
Right, because we have to remember when she's saying this.
Yeah, this speech is delivered in the 1930s in the dark, gathering shadow of a looming, devastating global war.
The atmosphere she is speaking into is incredibly high stakes.
Very high stakes. The threat of absolute violence is just hanging over European society, making her singular focus on the rights of toddlers and young children feel deeply poignant, but also remarkably urgent.
Yeah, she isn't just talking about how to make children slightly smarter or, more obedient for their parents.
No.
She is standing in front of international diplomats as the world is literally arming itself for World War II. And she is basically saying, if you want to stop the bombs, you have to look at the nursery.
Which is just a staggering claim. She is positioning a fundamental shift in our perspective of children as the only viable mechanism for human survival.
It's intense. It brings us directly to you, the person listening to this right now.
Exactly, because whether you are a parent trying to raise a good human, or an educator in a school system.
Or a leader managing teams in a corporate boardroom.
Right, or just someone who is endlessly curious about human nature and why people do the things they do. Your worldview has been entirely shaped by the traditional dynamic between adults and children.
You have been formed by it. You grew up inside it.
We all did. And this deep dive is going to reveal how that traditional way we view childhood might actually be the root cause of the societal chaos, the anxiety, and the conflict we see all around us today.
Right, because to even begin to understand how a child could possibly prevent a war, we first have to fundamentally redefine what a child actually is.
Yeah, the text demands a total teardown of the adult ego.
It really does.
Yeah.
So let's start that teardown. Montessori comes right out of the gate in this address with a massive redefinition.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Well, she says the ultimate goal of her entire movement is to help the adult world know, love, and serve the child.
Serve the child.
Yes. And she argues that doing this is the only way to elevate humanity to a new level of development.
Notice the verb she uses there, serve. That word immediately flips the traditional historical power dynamic completely upside down.
It totally does. Throughout almost all of human history, the expectation has always been that the child serves the adult.
Or, at the very least, that the child must submit to the adult's world.
Right. They have to follow the adult's rules and aspire to become the adult as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Children were historically viewed almost as property, or as, like, miniature defective adults who just needed to be fixed.
Yeah, if you look at a newborn baby, helpless is usually the very first word that comes to mind.
Of course. I mean, they can't feed themselves, they can't walk, they can't even regulate their own body temperature.
They can't speak a language.
Right, but Montessori fiercely rejects the idea that a child is merely a helpless, weak creature that only needs our protection and our care.
She does. Instead, she uses this incredible phrase. She calls the child a spiritual embryo.
A spiritual embryo. Okay, that is a profound and honestly scientifically fascinating concept. Let's break down why she uses that specific biological metaphor.
Yeah, let's look at the physical realm first. Before a baby is born, it is an embryo. And that physical embryo is incredibly busy.
Doing what?
Well, it is developing organs, bones, nervous systems, and complex physical structures according to a deeply encoded, ancient biological blueprint.
Right, nobody has to teach the embryo how to grow a heart.
Exactly. The instructions are already inside.
The mother provides the nutrition and the safe environment, but she isn't in there with a tiny wrench assembling the liver.
That's a great way to put it. The work is entirely self-directed by the organism's own internal laws.
So how does Montessori apply that?
What she is arguing is that from the exact moment of birth, the child continues this exact same embryological process, but now on a psychological and spiritual level.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they are endowed with an incredibly active psychic life and delicate internal instincts that are actively guiding the creation of the human personality.
So when a 6-month-old is just staring intently at their own hand, or a 2-year-old is obsessively moving a wooden block from one side of the room to the other over and over again.
They aren't just wasting time.
Right, they aren't just playing in the trivial sense we usually mean. They are engaged in heavy construction.
They're performing the most important, structurally critical work in the world. They are building the adult mind.
That is just wild to think about.
It is. They are laying down the neurological and psychological foundation for reason, for emotion, for socialization.
And because every adult was once a child, Montessori asserts that the child is the true creator of humanity.
She even goes so far as to call the child the father of our race.
The child is the father of the adult. It echoes that famous Wordsworth poem, but she is applying it as a literal scientific reality.
Yeah, and she says the child is ultimately our teacher.
Okay, let's unpack this. I have to stop and push back here a little bit on behalf of anyone who has ever spent an afternoon negotiating with a toddler.
Fair enough.
It is so easy to look at a small child throwing a fit because their banana broke in half and see a completely irrational, chaotic being.
Oh, absolutely.
So if they are the creators of humanity and our teachers, how does an adult practically serve them without just letting a 2-year-old dictate everything and run the entire household into the ground?
That's the common fear, right?
Yeah. I mean, if they are the creators, do we just get out of the way entirely? Think of it like a seed versus a lump of clay.
Oh, I like that analogy.
If the child is a seed with his own internal blueprint for a massive oak tree, are we saying the adult is just the dirt? Are we just the soil rather than the sculptor shaping a lump of clay into a masterpiece?
What's fascinating here is The text implies exactly that kind of shift in the adult's role. And your analogy of the seed versus the clay gets right to the heart of it.
Okay.
If the child is a spiritual embryo, it means that the laws leading humanity to its true, elevated, peaceful state are hidden entirely within the child.
So we don't build them.
No. The adult's role isn't to build the child from scratch. The adult is not the sculptor hacking away at a block of marble trying to force an image out of it.
Because if you hack at a seed with a chisel, you just kill the seed.
Precisely. The design for the human personality is already there, internal to the child. The adult's role is to uncover, to facilitate, and to protect those hidden laws.
We are the dirt.
We are the soil, the sunlight, and the water. We are the environment. We provide the boundaries and the nourishment, but we do not provide the blueprint.
Man, you have to realize how unbelievably radical this was for a room full of European intellectuals in the 1930s.
And honestly, how radical it still is today.
Oh, it's completely countercultural to how we parent and educate right now. We constantly talk about molding our children. We talk about shaping their futures.
Which is pure arrogance, according to this framework.
Wow.
To acknowledge the child as the father of the adult, to say, as she does, that the great mystery of our origin is hidden in the child, requires a massive relinquishing of adult ego.
I bet.
It requires the adult to step down from the pedestal of being the all-knowing creator, the absolute authority, the master architect of the child's soul.
And instead adopt a posture of humility and rigorous observation.
Exactly.
We have to watch the seed grow and ask, what kind of plant are you trying to become and how can I support that? Instead of saying, I have decided you will be a rose bush, so I'm going to paint your leaves red.
That's perfectly said. And the text suggests that because we have refused to adopt that humility, we have fundamentally broken the human experience.
Yeah, relinquishing the adult ego is incredibly difficult. We like being in charge.
We really do.
We like thinking we know best. So if the child has this internal blueprint, this delicate, ancient instinct guiding the creation of a harmonious personality, what happens when we ignore it?
It's not good.
Like, what happens when adults simply refuse to step down from that pedestal of authority?
Well, according to the text, that refusal isn't just a minor parenting mistake. It leads directly to society's core dysfunction.
It leads us into a devastating historical trap.
Yeah, the text mounts a really scathing critique of the traditional adult view, specifically attacking the concept of the child as a tabula rasa.
Ah, the tabula rasa, the blank slate.
Yes. This is a philosophical concept made famous by thinkers like John Locke centuries ago, which basically posits that a human being is born with no built-in mental content.
Just a completely passive, empty vessel with no internal will, no pre-programmed instincts, just waiting for the adult world to write upon it.
And Montessori argues that this is the most dangerous assumption humanity has ever made.
Really? The most dangerous?
Yes.
Oh.
Because when we treat a child as an empty vessel or a blank slate, the adult inevitably feels perfectly justified in forcing the child to submit.
Oh, I see.
If there is nothing inside the child guiding them, then the adult must provide all the direction.
It becomes our duty.
Exactly. The adult demands that the child adapt entirely and immediately to the adult's world, the adult's schedule, and the adult's will.
Because if the child is a blank slate, I, the adult, am doing them a favor by writing on them.
Right.
It's like, I am the programmer, I'm writing the code, therefore you must run my program. Sit still, be quiet, memorize this fact, eat at this exact time, sleep when I tell you to sleep.
But the child is not a blank slate. As we established, they are a spiritual embryo with their own delicate natural inclinations and a fierce internal drive to construct their own intelligence.
So when the adult forces submission,
When they interrupt that vital work for the sake of adult convenience, they are actively crushing those natural inclinations.
they are trampling on the child's internal blueprint.
Yes. And the text says this starts something deeply dangerous. It awakens a profound, irresistible resistance within the child. It triggers defensive instincts.
Okay, hold on. Let's ground this in reality. What does that actually look like if I'm watching a child? Does this just mean a toddler throwing a temper tantrum because they didn't get a cookie?
No, it's much deeper than that.
Yeah.
A tantrum over a cookie is a surface-level desire. Montessori is talking about the frustration of a biological imperative.
Okay, give me an example.
Imagine a toddler who is completely absorbed in watching an insect carry a crumb across the sidewalk.
Right.
They are intensely focused, absorbing information about physics, biology, spatial awareness. They are doing the heavy lifting of the spiritual embryo.
And then?
Then, An adult comes along, grabs them by the arm and says, "Hurry up, we are late for our lunch reservation," and physically yanks them away from their work.
Oh man, the adult's priority, the schedule, the lunch, completely overrides the child's priority, which was cognitive development.
Yes. And the child resists. They cry, they go limp, they scream.
And the adult views this as naughtiness.
Exactly, as a lack of discipline that needs to be punished or corrected.
Oh.
But Montessori views this as a vital defensive instinct.
Yeah.
The child is fighting for their psychological life.
Wow.
But because the adult is bigger, stronger, and holds all the resources, the adult almost always wins this battle.
And she says the consequences of the adult winning this battle aren't just temporary tears. She claims this constant suppression leads to actual spiritual diseases.
That is a terrifying phrase, isn't it? Spiritual diseases.
It really is.
The text is describing a silent, harsh, completely invisible battle taking place every single day in living rooms, classrooms, and on sidewalks all over the world between the adult and the child.
And the adult thinks they are educating or disciplining or socializing the child to be a good member of society.
But really, they are waging a war against the child's very nature.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's use an analogy here to really understand the mechanics of this spiritual disease.
I'm all ears.
Think about it like a complex, highly advanced piece of technology. Treating a child like a tabula rasa is like treating a cutting-edge supercomputer that comes brilliantly pre-programmed with an intricate, delicate, highly adaptive operating system, like treating it as if it's just a completely blank, formatting-ready hard drive.
Yeah, I follow.
The adult comes along and tries to force a completely incompatible, clunky, outdated operating system onto it. Let's call it the Adult Convenience OS. They plug it in and force the installation. What happens? The system crashes, it throws errors, it resists, the code gets corrupted. Are these spiritual diseases she mentions essentially the corrupted files, the glitches that are left over when the child's original operating system gets overwritten by force?
That is a brilliant way to visualize the mechanism at work here. The text makes it absolutely clear that this invisible battle is the exact mechanism that produces a broken adult society.
So it's not just a childhood phase.
No, because this battle happens at the very beginning of human life. During the most sensitive periods of brain development, it permanently alters the trajectory of the individual's growth.
It leaves permanent damage.
Yes. The text states that because of this battle, generation after generation of human beings are born not as developed, holistic, harmonious individuals, but as deformed beings.
Deformed beings. She really doesn't mince words.
No, she does not.
She is looking at normal, functioning adults going to work, paying taxes, and running governments, and she is calling them spiritually deformed.
She doesn't hold back at all. She says we are producing adults who are far removed from the image of a normal, healthy personality, specifically because their reason and their emotions have been completely severed and thrown out of harmony.
The system has crashed.
Exactly. When you force a child to ignore their own internal compass, when you punish them for their natural curiosity and force them to rely entirely on the external authority of the adult for validation, you break their internal guidance system.
So, if a child learns that their inner voice is always wrong and the adult's voice is always right, how does that manifest later? Like, what does a deformed adult actually look like in practice?
A deformed adult is someone who has lost touch with their own humanity. They might become hyper-obedient, always looking for a strong man or a dictator to tell them what to do because they were trained to always defer to the giant adult in the room.
Oh, wow. That has massive political implications.
Massive. Or they might become deeply apathetic, feeling like nothing they do matters because every time they tried to initiate a project as a child, it was interrupted or corrected.
All right.
Or they might become irrationally violent because the sheer frustration of having their spiritual embryo crushed for years has built up into an explosive resentment against the world.
So when we look out at the world and see adults acting with irrational violence, with deep apathy, with profound internal conflict, or blindly following destructive political movements, Montessori is telling us these aren't just bad political choices.
No, they are the symptom.
These are the spiritual diseases contracted during that invisible battle in childhood. This isn't just about someone having a somewhat unhappy or strict childhood. This is the literal genesis of societal collapse.
Exactly. The adult is actively deforming the creator of humanity. And they do it with the best of intentions, completely unaware of the damage they're causing.
So this invisible battle has been raging for generations.
Mhm.
We have been systematically deforming the father of our race for centuries, passing down these corrupted operating systems from one generation to the next.
It's a bleak picture.
It is, and because of that, the child's true status, their true importance in the fabric of society, has been completely overlooked. Which brings us to a really powerful label she uses in the text to describe the child's place in the world.
Yes, because they have been treated as blank slates, as property, as empty vessels to be filled. She coins a specific term for them. She calls the child the forgotten citizen.
The forgotten citizen. That phrase does a lot of heavy lifting.
It really does.
It implies that the child isn't just a future citizen, waiting in the wings to magically get their human rights when they blow out 18 candles on a birthday cake.
Right, they are a citizen right now.
In the present moment, but a completely marginalized one.
It's a radical political statement. A citizen has rights. A citizen has a voice. A citizen is entitled to an environment that supports their well-being. But our society is not built for this citizen.
No, it is not.
And to fix this deformed adult world, society must finally recognize the child's societal rights in the present. The text states that society must turn its face toward the child.
We have to stop looking only at adult institutions, the skyscrapers we talked about earlier, and look at the foundation.
Exactly.
But what does that actually require us to do?
The text says what society must do is create a new environment. An environment that specifically answers the child's living needs, enabling them to find what she calls spiritual freedom.
Okay, let me challenge this concept a bit, because spiritual freedom sounds beautiful but incredibly abstract. We talk a lot about environments today. We talk about workplace culture. We talk about curating our digital ecosystems for better mental health. We design our cities with urban planning for optimal traffic flow.
Right.
But Montessori is talking about a physical and spiritual environment specifically for the forgotten citizen.
Yeah.
How do we actually give a child spiritual freedom and justice when literally every aspect of our society is built entirely around the convenience, the physical size, the schedule, and the desires of adults?
It is a massive, almost overwhelming structural challenge. Think about the physical world a child navigates every day.
Okay.
The doorknobs are too high. The chairs are too big. The sinks are out of reach.
That's true.
The pace of life is dictated by adult jobs and adult efficiency. A child wants to spend 20 minutes observing a puddle. The adult needs to get to the grocery store. The child lives in a world that is physically hostile and temporally exhausting for them.
It's like living in a world built for giants who are constantly rushing you and yelling at you to keep up.
Exactly. So when she uses the phrase forgotten citizen, it fundamentally frames the child not as the property of their parents, which is how society often implicitly treats them.
Like, my house, my rules, you are an extension of me.
Yes. It frames the child as an independent entity with inherent rights to a space scaled to their needs and time scaled to their development.
Oh.
And recognizing those rights doesn't just affect the child, it shapes the entirety of humanity.
Because if they're allowed to construct themselves in an environment of spiritual freedom without the invisible battle, they won't grow up deformed.
Precisely.
So providing this environment isn't just a nice charitable thing to do for kids. It isn't just a luxury for wealthy parents who can afford tiny furniture. It is a biological and societal imperative.
The text calls it the grand social mission of humanity.
The grand social mission.
Yes. Our grandest mission as a species isn't to build taller skyscrapers or faster planes or more devastating weapons. It is to grant the child justice, harmony, and love in their formative environment.
Because, as the text insists, recognizing and nurturing the psychic roots within the child is the only way to determine whether the resulting adult will lean toward the light or toward destruction.
We are quite literally choosing our future by how we structure the child's environment today.
If we put them in an environment of submission, we breed conflict. If we put them in an environment of freedom and observation, we breed peace.
Exactly. And the text provides a very clear ultimatum here. The only way to fulfill this grand social mission, the only way to build a new world and bring peace into it, is through education.
Education.
Yes, education isn't just a system for transferring facts from a teacher's brain into a student's brain so they can pass a test and join the workforce. Education is the sole path to societal salvation. It is the defense of the human spirit.
But let's pause here and look at the brutal reality of when she was speaking. We've established her premise, education is the path to a new world. We need to create environments for spiritual freedom. But she is delivering this address in the late 1930s. The very real physical shadow of war is looming over Europe. Fascism is on the rise. Armies are actively building up their munitions. Political tensions are boiling over.
Yes, the threat of violence is not a theoretical debate in a university hall. It is imminent. It is on the front page of every newspaper.
Yeah.
People are terrified.
Right. So imagine being in that audience. If I'm sitting in that Congress hearing about the threat of global war and someone tells me the answer is to redefine how we view toddlers, to let them have more spiritual freedom, I might be deeply skeptical.
Anyone would be.
How does changing the way we view children in a classroom actually stop armies from marching across borders? It sounds like bringing a beautifully painted picture to a machine gun fight. And Montessori actually anticipates this reaction, doesn't she?
She does. She tackles that skepticism head on. She admits right in the text that bringing up the topic of education for peace during an epoch when the threat of a new industrialized war is constantly hanging over society might sound like the worst kind of naive idealism.
She knows it sounds absurd on the surface.
But she doesn't back down an inch. In fact, she argues it is the most practical, creative, and uniquely effective way to resist war.
Okay, how does she justify that massive leap? How is early childhood education more practical than, say, diplomacy or military deterrence?
She starts by looking at the track record of the adult world. She argues that war and the adult systems that produce war offer no hope whatsoever.
They just perpetuate the cycle.
Right. Adult logic doesn't answer any modern human needs. Violence and coercion don't solve the underlying problems. They just rearrange the pieces on the board temporarily.
Makes sense.
Instead, she says humanity, guided by these deformed adults, has sunk into a state of barbarism and spiritual chaos.
Spiritual chaos. There's that concept of the spiritual again. That directly links back to the spiritual diseases caused by the invisible battle of childhood we talked about earlier.
Exactly. The adults who are currently in power, the ones stockpiling weapons and aggressively marching toward war, are the very deformed beings we analyzed. They are the ones whose reason and emotion were severed during childhood. And she uses this incredibly evocative, haunting metaphor to describe the modern individual living in this chaos. She says the individual feels like a grain of sand in a barren desert.
A grain of sand in a barren desert. That is such a vivid picture of complete alienation. Let's unpack what that actually means for the listener right now, because this is where the text jumps out of the 1930s and lands right in our laps.
It really does feel relevant today.
So what does this all mean? You, listening to this, you might feel exactly like that grain of sand when you scroll through the news today. You see global conflicts, you see massive economic instability, you see intense political polarization that seems impossible to bridge, and you probably feel utterly overwhelmed.
You feel small.
You feel completely powerless to change the tide of history. And the text says that the modern person is entirely unaware of the true threats of their era until they become the powerless victims of them.
That is the tragedy of the barren desert. You don't see the sandstorm coming until it buries you.
So, is she essentially saying that protesting or fighting the adults currently in power is almost too late? The die is already cast for that generation?
That's the implication, yeah.
If their operating systems are already deeply corrupted by spiritual diseases, is she saying true peace requires bypassing them entirely and starting over with an entirely new, undeformed generation?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, she is offering a profound psychological diagnosis of modern society. She is saying that adults are blind to the threats of their era. They don't see the catastrophic consequences of their actions until the bombs actually start falling, because adults are fundamentally disconnected from the laws of life.
What does she mean by the laws of life?
She means the natural instinct toward harmony, toward creation, toward cooperation that is built into the spiritual embryo.
The blueprint.
Right. Because of that invisible battle they suffered as children, because they were forced to submit and ignore their inner compass, their reason and emotion are completely unmoored. They are spiritually chaotic.
They cannot build peace because they do not have peace inside them.
Therefore, taking urgent, decisive action for humanity doesn't mean fighting the current deformed adults using adult methods, more force, more coercion, more war. It means, first and foremost, taking action for the child.
Because the child still holds those uncorrupted laws of life intact. The seed hasn't been crushed yet.
Yes. The text argues that we can only escape this barren desert of spiritual chaos by letting the secret laws of normal psychic development, the laws hidden in the child, illuminate the path for our entire civilization.
So if the adults are lost in the dark desert, completely blind to the reality of their situation, the child is the only flashlight we have.
Exactly.
That is a staggering amount of pressure to put on the concept of early education, to say, we adults have ruined it, we are fundamentally broken, save us.
It is a lot of pressure.
But she doesn't frame this immense shift from chaos to peace as just a theoretical pie-in-the-sky wish. She frames it as an inevitable historical epoch. She divides human history into two distinct eras.
Yes, she creates a very stark historical dichotomy to emphasize the magnitude of this shift. She looks back at human history, and she says the era of constant, repeating flashes of war, of domination, of colonialism, the era we have been living in, where brute force and coercion rule society, should be called the century of the adult.
The century of the adult, defined by force, by ego, by deformation, by the invisible battle of the strong imposing their will on the weak.
Contrast that with the epoch where she believes the building of true peace will finally begin. She proclaims that this new era, the one we must strive for, will be the century of the child.
The century of the child.
This will be an era where the laws of life, of organic development, finally triumph over brute force.
And what's fascinating is that she grounds this grand, sweeping historical theory in the very physical geopolitical reality of the Congress itself.
She does.
She uses the specific location and the attendees to prove to the audience that nations are actually beginning to wake up and listen to this radical idea. The Congress is taking place in Denmark, and she heavily praises Denmark for its role on the world stage.
She praises the host country deeply, noting that the Danish government has provided generous, official hospitality and support for the Congress.
Why Denmark specifically?
She holds Denmark up as a shining example, a nation that actively honors peace and values the treasures of the human mind over military might. She sees their willingness to officially host and fund this Congress as a tangible sign that they are ready to turn toward the problem of the child and recognize education as the primary instrument for building lasting peace.
And she draws a very specific historical parallel here in the text. She reminds the audience that 8 years prior to this meeting, the very first conference dedicated specifically to the child was also held in Denmark. Specifically, it was held in the city of Elsinore.
Yes, and the geographical and cultural details she chooses to highlight are deeply symbolic. She mentions that Elsinore is located right next to the famous royal castle that inspired the legend of Shakespeare's Hamlet.
Wait, hold on a second. She mentions Hamlet's castle, and then, in the exact same breath, she points out that Denmark is the homeland of the great storyteller Hans Christian Andersen, whose fairy tales bring joy to children all over the entire globe.
Yes, she does.
That feels like a bizarre combination of references. If you think about it, Hamlet represents the ultimate bloody tragedy of an adult political betrayal. It's a story of madness, of violence, of poison, and deep corruption in the halls of power.
It is the epitome of adult ego destroying a kingdom.
Exactly. On the other hand, Hans Christian Andersen represents wonder, joy, imagination, and stories written specifically for the spiritual nourishment of children. Is she doing this on purpose? Is she using Denmark's own cultural icons to subtly but powerfully contrast the darkness of the century of the adult with the light of the century of the child?
This raises an important question, and you've hit the nail on the head. It's a brilliant observation, and it cuts right to the core of her rhetorical strategy.
So it's not just a passing mention.
Not at all. She isn't just casually mentioning tourist landmarks to flatter her hosts. She is drawing a stark literary line in the sand. She is saying that after World War I, which ended shortly before that first conference in Elsinore, society tried to build peace using the tools of Hamlet politics, treaties, maneuverings, but it failed.
It failed miserably.
It failed because true peace requires a profound spiritual transformation.
Because the hope they felt 8 years ago didn't last. The war did not stay in the past. It just took a brief pause before gearing up again.
Exactly. And that spiritual transformation goes completely against the prevailing intellectual currents of the time, which are solely obsessively focused on the adult. She's essentially arguing that you cannot build a Hans Christian Andersen world using the political tactics of Hamlet.
You can't fix the adult world with adult tools because the adult tools are what broke it in the first place.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
And to prove that this idea of turning to the child isn't just an isolated movement of eccentric teachers, she leverages international diplomacy in the final section of her address.
Right.
She isn't just speaking as a lone philosopher with a fringe theory. She's actively rallying the global community against these adult-centric intellectual currents.
The text lists an incredible array of international support. It's not just a few sympathetic teachers in a room. She specifically names the support of 25 different countries.
That's an impressive list.
She lists them out for the audience to hear. Belgium, Catalonia, Chile, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece, Haiti, the Canton of Ticino, Latvia, Mexico, Romania, Russia, the United States of America, and Egypt. All of these nations either sent official, government-sanctioned representatives or had diplomats present at the opening ceremonies.
She also publicly thanks specific high-ranking government officials to cement this political legitimacy.
Like who?
Well, she thanks her colleague, Wilhelm Rasmussen, the director of a state teacher training institute in Copenhagen. She expresses deep gratitude to the Danish Prime Minister, Stauning.
The Prime Minister.
Yes. She thanks the Minister for Social Affairs, Ludvig Christensen, who acted as an honorary chairman of the Congress. And perhaps most tellingly, she thanks the foreign minister, Dr. Munch, who personally addressed the Congress.
A foreign minister, a person whose literal job is managing international relations, treaties, and the threat of war, is speaking at an early childhood education conference. It's a massive show of diplomatic force. Why is she doing this? Why spend precious time in an opening address listing all these politicians and countries?
Because she is placing the geopolitical fate of the entire world squarely on the shoulders of early childhood education, and she wants everyone to see that governments are starting to realize it. By listing these nations and these powerful men, she is demonstrating that the weak call of the child, a call that has been ignored for centuries during the invisible battle, a call that was drowned out by the noise of adult ambition, is finally being heard on a global diplomatic scale.
It's no longer just a domestic issue. It's an issue of statecraft.
Yes, she says the central theme of their Congress is being supported by these governments, almost as a command. Educate for peace. It validates her entire premise that the defense of the child is not a soft secondary issue. It is the most vital foundational matter of international security and human survival.
It is a breathtaking reframing of what it means to educate a child. Let's take a moment to recap the monumental journey we've just taken through this single, powerful address.
It's been a lot to process.
We started with the radical idea of tearing down the adult ego and viewing the child not as a helpless blank slate waiting for our instructions, but as a brilliant spiritual embryo carrying the hidden laws of human perfection inside them.
And we uncovered the tragic invisible battle that occurs when we, as well-meaning but arrogant adults, try to force our own clunky operating systems onto that embryo.
And we saw in vivid detail how that forced submission crushes the child's delicate instincts, sparking a deep resistance and causing profound spiritual diseases.
We traced how those childhood spiritual diseases manifest directly as the chaos, the apathy, the barbarism, and the violence of the adult world, what she so perfectly calls the century of the adult.
We learned that the only literal path out of this barren desert, the only way to prevent the modern individual from feeling like a powerless grain of sand caught in a storm, is to grant the forgotten citizen their right to a specialized environment and true spiritual freedom.
We have to shift our entire paradigm from the century of the adult to the century of the child.
Exactly.
Ultimately, this text asks every single one of us to do something incredibly difficult. It asks us to fundamentally check our adult egos at the door.
Which is so hard.
It is. It asks us to look at the massive conflicts in our governments, the deep anxieties in our workplaces, and the wars looming on our horizons, and realize that the secret to saving humanity isn't going to be found in a political treaty or a boardroom.
No.
It is currently sitting in a sandbox, trying to understand the world, just waiting for us to stop fighting it and start serving it.
Which leaves us with one final, lingering thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. If Montessori is right, if the conflicts, the anxieties, the rigid thinking, and the wars of the adult world are just the manifested, grown-up versions of the spiritual diseases caused by our crushed childhood instincts, what natural, delicate inclination was suppressed in you when you were a child?
Yeah, what curiosity or drive was interrupted in the name of adult convenience?
And how is that invisible wound secretly shaping the way you view the world and the people around you today?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.